The Zora Neale Hurston Trust presents the It's All About Zora series. We'll be discussing all things Zora with artists, academics, and fans of Zora Neale Hurston on the It's All About Zora series. Plus, we will uncover her influences on our guests' lives and work. So let's get the conversation started. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today on the It's All About Zora series. So excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about Zora and loving your work too. So looking forward to chopping it up with you.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it. So I know when it comes to Zora, there's always like this origin story of the first time we experienced her, we found her. Can you tell me a little bit about yours?
Yes. So I'm a graduate of Barnard College, as is Zora. So I graduated in 1985. So this was somewhere between 81 and 85. I was in the library and I think it was Black History Month, and there were bookmarks with Black women writers who had graduated from Barnard. Saw these names and saw Zora Neale Hurston's name. So I wanted to find out about the ones that I did not know about, which included Zora Neale Hurston. Also happened to take a course with a professor who has since passed, Quandra Prettyman. She was teaching a course about women writers of color. And Zora Neale Hurston's work was on that syllabus. Our alma mater is where I first encountered Zora, and glad I did.
Her alma mater is repping her, and I think putting that time frame on it for someone to die with all of their books out of print, that's Zora. And then you're saying in 1985, so that's 25 years after her death, that Barnard was representing Zora. And I have to ask, because you're an alum of Barnard, can you give a little bit about the history and what's significant about Zora having went there in the late 1920s?
Well, she was the first African-American graduate of the school. There are some records about her experience there and what certain administrators were saying behind the scenes about admitting her, which was not flattering. So she attended Howard for 2 years, transferred to Barnard, actually came to New York at the behest of Alain Locke and other sort of New York, DC Black literary crew. And while she was here, she was encouraged to apply to Barnard, and she got in. That history really, though, was also undergirded by alums in the 70s. Alice Walker sort of establishing Zora's burial place. Any number of Black women writers and scholars had been Xeroxing Their Eyes Were Watching God and sharing it because, it had been out of print. So really owing it to those women in the 70s, including some Black women Barnard alums, sharing this book and saying, why isn't this woman in our canon, in our collective consciousness? And so really, I'm just giving thanks to them also for bringing Zora to my and everyone's attention.
It's almost like being in this lineage of Black women writers and artists and scholars who say, like, we have to keep Zora alive. So when did you decide that you had to be a part? Because I'm sure Zora is not very subtle. That there was something and you were like, I have to do it. Can you tell me about that?
I have always loved her audacity and her forthrightness. I think I have that quality also, so I appreciate it in her. While at Barnard, I took a history class about women's autobiographies. My final paper was on 3 different Black women's life writings. So there was Alice Dunbar Nelson's Give Us Each Day, Alice Walker's The Color Purple, and I used Zora Neale Hurston's Dust Tracks on the Road. So that was the first time I said, you know what, I need to write Zora into my own sort of quote unquote scholarly legacy. It wasn't until 2004 it was established that Oprah Winfrey's company would be adapting Their Eyes Are Watching God with ABC Disney. And I said, this is a milestone. This needs to be written about in our alumni magazine. The film was going to premiere that January 2005. And while doing research for that magazine. I didn't know this, but 10 years later, that would be my dissertation topic. So blending my magazine writing with my TV writing, and then later when I got my PhD. So these key times in my life when I said, you know what, if I'm going to write something that has resonance, it's going to be about Zora. So yeah.
We have to talk about Their Eyes Were Watching God, the book versus the movie adaptation, because that's one of the most popular questions I get. What do I think Zora would have thought about it? Tell me what you think about it from the perspective of a screenwriter, or what you would have done differently, if anything.
Writing those articles about the adaptation, that's where I met virtually, and then eventually I met in person Valerie Boyd, who basically was anointed by Robert Hemingway to write a new biography on Zora. And so a lot of the reinterest, I would say, is due to Valerie Boyd's work. And she was a key person that I interviewed about the adaptation. Zora did work in Hollywood for a while and was a story editor at Paramount. And one of the publishers had submitted some of her fictional work to Warner Brothers to be considered for adaptation at the time, and nothing happened with it. So I think in a general sense, Zora would be really happy that this work has been translated for the screen. I think scholars have the most dissatisfaction because scholars tend to be more exact. And since I'm in both worlds, I can say that safely, but understanding what is required to create a film period, but also to adapt a 300-page book to a 2-hour movie, you have to make certain changes. I think it's the kinds of changes that you make that are up for debate. Some things that I wish were not changed in the adaptation. A key line where Janie's grandmother says, "The nigger woman is the mule of the world." In the adaptation, Ruby Dee only says, "The woman is the mule of the world," right? So I think taking the racial element of that statement away veers off course a little bit, because Zora was specifically talking about the experience of a Black woman. That little change to me was like, in trying to make something universal, sometimes you kind of take the power out of it. Another thing I wish had been treated in the film was the courtroom scene where she's on trial for killing tea cake. I understand why it was taken out, like it pulled away from the trajectory. It would have been thrilling, number one, and it would have been another chance to highlight this idea of Black people being on trial. So those are two areas that I would have kept in the film. What the adaptation did really well, which is really thrilling, was the flood scene. It was chilling to me. I was like, okay, y'all got that. Y'all got that. So overall, I think Zora would be happy. People had all kinds of opinions about, should Halle Berry play this or whatever. I think Zora, because she was known for not looking her age, I had less problem with that. And just, little things like, oh, you should have kept that in, because it would have kept, a lot of the statements that Zora was trying to make about the experience of a Black woman in this time period. That was taken out, because it was a mainstream ABC production. There can be any number of critiques, but I think it was well done.
It's easy to critique when you're the one consuming, because we consume so quickly, versus like, okay, this is a business, and this is like, we're trying to get this project out. And so I think that that's a huge triumph, not only for Zora, but her family, being the Zora Neale Hurston Trust, to actually accomplish one of Zora's lifelong dreams. Zora went out to California with the idea of working in these production studios because she was friends with Fannie Hurst, and she's looking at all of these other authors and white authors, and she's like, hey, I'm like up to 6 books at this time. I have great stuff that we can adapt into film. And she had I would say, the appropriate gravitas to say that, because her focus had been Negro, I think we were Negroes at that time, Negro folk theater. And so then translating that onto the screen was a normal step to think that she could take. And so I do want to recognize the trust and everybody involved, because to actually produce that Oprah, Quincy Jones, to actually produce Their Eyes Are Watching God, when it was out of print at the time that Zora died in 1960, is a huge feather, I think, in Zora's hat.
The other feather, I would think, and I don't know how much the trust was involved in this, but the Netflix documentary Descendant, Barracoon is central to that documentary. And, you know, Deborah Plant's even in the documentary, who edited Barracoon. And so for two of Zora's works to be immortalized, so to speak, in these two different genres of film is, I think, long overdue, but so glad that they exist.
And so just a note for the viewers, you can absolutely watch Descendant on Netflix and you can see Zora's footage. You can hear her singing. And that documentary is Barracoon, like, come to life.
There's also a documentary on PBS about Zora that focuses on the anthropology and the politics behind her experience.
I think that's one of the most important works for the African diaspora and anyone who considers themselves an ally to read.
I can't even overstate not only how significant the book is for all of us, but just the resonance, reading every word. I'm like, I think our ancestors it's so far removed because there's been so much trauma between Africa and us here. And I'm like, what a gift that she actually got to speak to the person that they knew at the time, who had that both experiences, who could talk about his life in Africa and what happened. Zora Neale Hurston in 1927 was commissioned to do field work interviewing the last known enslaved African alive on American soil. She didn't do well the first time, so she was sent back and unlearned some formal anthropological techniques and got back to what she knew from her Florida upbringing, and was able to interview Cujo Lewis, Oluwale Kosola is his name, and was really able to get in a human way what the experience was like. We read about enslavement so much in an academic way, but this was a human story. So literally every word he said, it was like gold for me.
To put it into context, like what Zora was doing then, this is 1927, and she's a single woman driving around the American South by herself as one of the very few Black women anthropologists trained out of Columbia, which was affiliated and is affiliated with Barnard. And so when we think about how much just her foresight, right? She kind of had to take off that Barnardese, as she called it, that language, and say, just as you said, let me lay some of these formal tools down, or let me figure out how to blend them in a way where I can get this man to talk. But one of the things that I learned in my research is often when there was an anthropological subject, all the anthropologists, most of them white men, would flock there and drive that subject, that person, nuts, right? And so he had already been interviewed quite a few times and he wouldn't talk to people. And so in 1927, he looked at Zora and was like, I'm not talking to you either. And then she learned how to do essentially participatory anthropology, where she was like, okay, whatever you're doing, I'm going to do, right? We're going to eat watermelon. We're going to eat crabs out the
peaches, ham.
Peaches. I'm going to bring you some ham. And I think that's real smart because that's that Southern element, you know, of our Black culture. And with her being a Southerner, she absolutely was like, okay, when I go back, I'm going to do this right. I'm going to do this the way that we do. You bring something to someone's house when you want to talk to them.
Right. Don't come empty-handed. That's right. And I think the other significant thing is not only did she talk to him and we have this written text, but she also took footage. So she was a filmmaker. I mean, come on. That's remarkable, as you said, for a woman who was coming up in the 20s as an adult or young adult, depending on which year of her birth you're talking about. Even though Franz Boas wanted her to go down there and Charlotte Mason, they all wanted her to go down there and get the information. when it came to time to support her, to further her opportunities, some of those letters of recommendation were a little sketchy. I was like, backstabbing. Woo! We can understand now when she passed away, she was financially destitute. No one was helping her. It was like everybody wanted her to do this work that she was good at, but no one was backing her up to continue to advance herself and support herself.
That circles back to exactly what you were saying about that line. And They're Also Watching God that didn't make the adaptation. Like Black women, nigger women are the muse of the world. And so she was a tool because Charlotte Osgood Mason, for our viewers, was Zora's patron. And interestingly enough, we say that was Zora's patron, but she and Langston Hughes shared the same patron. Langston Hughes had true patronage for his work. Zora's contract was for employment. So Zora wasn't allowed to essentially do her own work that she wanted to do. It was carried out with this white woman. And I interviewed Carla Kaplan and she said it. I was like, oh, I wonder, is this a thing? She was like this very racist white woman who is patronizing these young Black artists, but using them in a way that is useful to her while considering herself not to be racist. Talk to us about your precedent original research on Zora and Langston.
I phrase it that way for political reasons of my own. My dissertation is on Zora and Langston's relationship. When I was doing the research for the articles about the adaptation, it sort of dawned on me in a way that I had never thought about before that this is the Black people's Algonquin Roundtable. And just kind of reading about their relationships, it's like, yeah, they were not just writers socializing. I said, they were friends. And so I was particularly piqued about Zora and Langston and what supposedly happened between them. And I said, if I had the time, I would really research this more deeply. And so I started my PhD program in October 2005. And so in 2007, when we had to kind of start narrowing down what our dissertation topics would be on, I had a list of 5 things. And then it dawned on me, that is my dissertation topic. So my PhD is in depth psychology, which is primarily Jungian psychology, the psychology of the unconscious and the effect of the unconscious psyche on our conscious behavior. And I said, this is the perfect lens through which to research what happened between them. So I think in publishing world terms, it could be considered psychobiography. And so psychobiography is a genre where you look at a writer's first person writings primarily, but also all their other writings to come to some determination, some sort of psychological makeup or psychological sketch of who this person is. I used the archetype of the brother-sister pair, primarily Isis and Osiris, or Osset and Osar, as sort of the template. Literally, I went from here's Zora's experience and what the psychological underpinnings were from birth until she moved to New York. Here's Langston's from birth until he moved to New York. Here's what happened when they met, what that brother-sister dynamic is like. Here's the influence of the Harlem Renaissance on that relationship. And then here's what, according to my research and observations and conclusions, this is what happened. This is really what made their relationship deconstruct. It was inspired by doing the work on the adaptation back in 2004. So I say precedent because it was published and copywritten before any other work that is similar. And it was Valerie Boyd who advised me to be careful about sharing my Zora and Langston research. I appreciated that. And when you do research like that, you can't try to be friends with people, right? And so you have to look at all the scholarship that is out there and be critical of it. At the time of doing my dissertation, an experienced writer in television and magazines, I'm not the same 800-pound established scholar that others are in the field. And so who's going to get published? Me trying to get my thing published or somebody else? So yeah, but mine was first.
There's a line of demarcation between scholarship, as you say, for the purpose of having that status, right? And then there's a very distinct quality you can tell in people who like love Zora. And so I think what you are saying, it definitely resonates with me. And there are politics, just for our viewers, there are politics around the legacies of our greats and how we put them up out there and how we approach them. And so I definitely want to thank you for your work, because that's what it takes. And that's exactly who Zora was, right? At the time she was doing anthropology or starting out, like, she was attacked, and then again in literary, by her people and by the others. They were saying, this is not how you do it, using this language and this Black language, this Ebonics, this vernacular, this dialect, which is funny because she never really talks about using dialect. She's always like the Black idiom, but she's like, that's just the dialogue. That's how we talk. And so you think of what her legacy and her canon, how it would be different if she had budged. Even on Barracoon, they didn't want to publish it because she recorded it 100% phonetically, and how Oluwale Kasula spoke, which was a talent as an anthropologist, right? And they're like, no, that's not how you do anthropology. That's not how you do it. Even though they were getting nowhere with researching Black people and Black culture, because there was that featherbed resistance that Zora always talked about. And they were so obtuse, they didn't even know that they were being resisted.
And you know, it's important you say that because I presented at the Zora Fest in 2010. And I remember during one of the opening sort of gatherings, someone from the neighborhood kind of stood up and said, "What do you all want with us?" And I understood that. It's like, all you scholars coming here for a week and poking around, like, what do you want? Right. And because, as you said, sometimes when you're coming to something and it involves your career, you're all about that. And the people that you are speaking about and speaking to are the flesh and blood. And they're like, what do you want? Right? What do you want? And so I think the way your work highlights or teaches about Zora keeps that humanity in mind. I just think that's so important. They're all related, whether you're writing, whether you're doing oral presentations, oral histories, whether you're filming, it's all about someone's life, right? And so you can't lose that human quality. I'm probably more critical of scholars than filmmakers. Scholars, I think that because they're dealing in facts or research, that somehow that work is more valuable or more valid or more accurate than some other way of engaging things. And, you know, that's not so. I appreciate all the different aspects. And Zora had all of them: oral history, straight up anthropology, fiction, nonfiction. She put her full self into all of her work. That's more than we can ask. That's more than a lot of people do. So very grateful for her for that.
My grandmother used to always say, well, work with me now. And that's how Zora was. She will work with you. Like, wherever you're at, I'm going to meet you there and still get you this information in the best way that you can receive it. And so I do thank you for that recognition, because I try to carry that even when I'm presenting to children. Being a scholar, you do want to say, objectively, this is the truth, right? But Zora lied about her age for very good reason. She wanted to finish high school for free. She needed to at the age of 26. But she had to move in and out of worlds that require a certain level of fluidity, right? She had to be able to negotiate these different settings and working with these different groups and these different people. And so Zora herself, I would say she's a bit like folklore, right? It's different on everybody's tongue. And I think that that's special. And I think that's one of the reasons for me, I'm like, all the work, just give it to me so I can read it, so I can watch it, so that I can understand her in different ways. And so I'm definitely adding your work to that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Why do you think Zora's legacy persists?
Because wisdom never expires. Probably my favorite book is her autobiography, because so many people misread it or they dismiss it. Oh, Zora lies, so we can just overlook that. And I'm like, no, she's telling you exactly who she is. So yeah, her mother said jump at the sun, But can we not just make that the tagline for everything? What her mother expected of her tormented her for the rest of her life. So we can't just, oh, she said jump at the sun. No, she also said some other things that broke Zora. That, for me, is why it persists, not because of the scholarly consensus around a lot of things where, everybody agrees that, yeah, this is the story. I'm like, no, it's not the story. Did y'all miss this thing that she wrote right here? Did y'all not see that? It doesn't fit into the narrative, so you just kind of absent that. You can read things that Zora has written or Zora had written, 80 years ago, and it still makes sense. It is still true. Again, it persists because, Maya Angelou and Still We Rise, right? The attempt to suppress her or to abandon her was, as you said, we can't underestimate all the different ways that she was not respected the way other people and their work was respected. Zora was wise, and wisdom will always resonate for those who are willing to pay attention. I think we're going to continue, of course, to see more evolution in how we interact with Zora's work. So it started with, women Xeroxing some of her out of print stuff, and then it shifted to something else, and then it shifted to something else. So it's generative. We have only just begun to look at her. And I think my work comes in because I purposely look at her differently than what's already been published. Not because I'm just being contrary, but because even as someone working on my PhD who didn't have access to a lot of what some of the other established scholars had access to, I'm like, well, I'm seeing a lot of stuff here, right? That no one has even included in the consideration because it doesn't fit a narrative. I need to add to what the narrative is by looking at the things that everybody else either ignored, overlooked. As long as we continue to be honest in our work on her, she will always continue to resurrect in one way or the other.
We have to have a little contrarian in us because if we're daughters of Zora, right? That's her.
That's right.
That this is what doesn't exist, so let me create it. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I'm sure this is just the first of many conversations because you have so much to share, and we need all the angles to add depth and to round it out, and to have perspective, because in my opinion, that adds our meat, our skin, our bones back onto Zora. And I believe it was Alice Walker who said, a people resurrects their genius bone by bone if necessary. So thank you. And Alice Walker, please, if we ever meet, don't get me. But that's one of my favorite quotes, but I know I've messed it up. But she talks about bringing our ancestors, our geniuses back to life, bone by bone. And I remember I felt like that was a call to action. So I was like, let me get my shovel and dig up these bones right alongside, everyone else who is doing that work. And I consider you one of those people. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was beautiful. I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Zora Neale Hurston Trust, also for being a great steward and for making sure that this work never gets burned up again because no one knows the value of it. So thank you. And I just look forward to even more work that we don't know about yet. Really honored to be part of this conversation.